So welcome everyone. We're about to start our webinar, and we're excited to have Wes Trochlil here today. Wes, I've worked with you since 2007. I think that's a sort of a nod to associations and how long people stay in the industry. And it's really been a pleasure. I'm really excited to have you present today. And we're going to talk about the 7 things we need to think about when choosing an AMS. So with that, let me introduce Wes Trochlil, consultant. Thank you, Wes.
Thanks, Paul. Welcome, everybody. Let me, hey, Gil, it says I've been disabled from sharing my screen.
And let me recommend, and thank you, everyone that is attending. Let me recommend that please ask us questions within chat, and we will make sure that we get them answered as we go along. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So welcome again, everybody. What I want to do over the next 45 minutes or so is walk you through a process that I've used with several hundred of my clients over the past 25 years to help them select new association management software systems. And what I'm going to do is I'll outline the 7 steps first, and then we'll go into each of those by detail again over the next 45 minutes. And like Paul said, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, and he'll interrupt me when it's appropriate, or maybe when it's inappropriate, but feel free to interrupt me whenever, Paul. Okay, so before we jump in though, there's 3 things I want you to keep in mind. The first is that for this process, we're talking about off-the-shelf software. So some of this process could be applied to building custom software. But again, this process is really designed for association management software that has been purpose-built, whether that's on a platform like Salesforce or whether it's a completely bespoke system, but it's designed for AMS products that you buy off the shelf as opposed to building it. Second thing to keep in mind is that, believe it or not, most of your success in this process requires time, not money. Obviously, money is important. You have to have the budget if you want to get a certain kind of product. But what will make you successful is taking the time to follow these steps and to do them, to really think about what you're doing as you work through the process. And then finally, this is probably the most important thing if you take away nothing else. No off-the-shelf system, and frankly, no system that's even been custom built is perfect. There are always areas where the system doesn't quite do what you want it to do, or does it in a different way. And we really need to accept that. And I emphasize this because I've worked with many associations over the years. In fact, I had a call just the other day from a group like this where they narrowed their choices down, but they couldn't make a choice because they kept finding something wrong with each of the systems. And the reality is there is always going to be something wrong, in air quotes, with the system, because no system is going to be perfect. So just keep that in mind as you go through the process, as you make those decisions. And frankly, as long as you're using your AMS, it's never going to be perfect, but we're just looking to make it as successful as possible. Okay, so let us go look at the 7 steps that I use with my clients as we select a new association management software system. Step number 1 is identifying business objectives. And I'm going to go through this at a high level right now, and then we'll go into some details. But the business objectives is, why are you making a switch at this point? What's driving the need for your association management software system to be replaced? Or if you don't have one, that could be a reason. But what are those reasons for making the change? And then we'll talk about why that's important. The second step in the process is the needs analysis. And I often think of this as, when I say selecting a new system, this is what people think of most of the time, which is we've got to write down what we need. Right? We need to understand what our needs are for a new system. So we need to document that. And again, we'll talk about that in detail. But I think that's one of the most critical steps in this process. Third step then is development of an RFP, a request for proposal. The RFP, as far as I'm concerned, is the formal communication between you, the association, and the vendors. And so again, you want documentation to be able to refer to. And I've had many of my clients refer to the RFP as the Bible as they go through this process. It's the thing they refer back to whenever there's a question, a concern. Did we talk about that? Did the vendor say we could do that? Those kind of things. That's what the RFP is for. So we'll talk about what that should look like. Fourth step in the process then is identifying vendors that you actually want to talk to. And I'll say this now, and I'll say it again later. You should be sending that RFP to no more than 6 vendors. Somewhere between 4 and 6 is kind of the magic number. Typically, I'm doing 5 with my clients, but between 4 and 6, you don't want too few because you do want to see what options are available, but you certainly don't want to send it to 8 or 10 or, God forbid, 15 or 20. But I've seen that happen, and I suspect, Paul, on your side, you've seen that happen as well, where you're receiving an RFP from an association that sent it to 20 different vendors. And the reality is, if you're sending it to 20 different vendors, you actually haven't done your homework. And again, we'll talk in detail about what that means.
Yep.
Step 5 then is reviewing those RFP responses. And this actually, because you have to do this, this is one of the reasons why you don't send it to 10 or 15 or 20 vendors, because if you get 15 or 20 responses, you have an obligation to review those. And so we want to make sure the work on your side is time well spent. And we want to make sure we're not wasting the time of the vendors as well. But we'll talk about how to review an RFP so that you can make, to the extent possible, make those apples to apples comparisons. Step number 6 is product demonstration, which is the demos. And a lot of times people think about these as the first step in the process. And I actually have a bias against that. And what I mean by that is I don't like demos to come first in the process, because what happens very frequently is you get what I call an anchoring effect, meaning that the first demo that you really like, or the first product you really like, that becomes the bar by which you measure all the other products. That might be okay, but it actually might not be okay, because it's conceivable that product doesn't actually do everything you need it to do, or that it's too expensive for you, it's out of your budget range, or there's some other mitigating factors that would suggest you're not actually going to be able to choose that product. And by having that anchor early on, that can skew all your perceptions from that point on. So I intentionally put the demos at near the end of the process. And then finally, go back one, is the selection of the product and negotiating the contract. And I'll give you some tips there on how to deal with that. And now, before I go any further, I just want to share the results here of the poll that we did just before you guys came on here. And so it looks like 75% of the attendees are beginning the search, and 25% are in the final selection phase. All right, so that's good to know. And so those are the 7 steps, and let's jump into each of those in a little more detail. And Paul, if there are any questions as we go, please interrupt me.
Will do, absolutely.
All right, so step number 1, identifying business objectives. This is something I think you should just take a little time. It doesn't require a day-long meeting by any means. It's probably something you can do within an hour of sitting down with the staff to talk about it. But what is it that we're trying to accomplish with a new AMS? And so as you'll see, I'm going to give you some examples here, but as you'll see, this isn't so much about functionality as it is, what is the end game? What are we trying to accomplish? And here are the 4 most common objectives I hear from my clients. My suspicion is you'll fit at least a couple of these. But I also want to add, these are just the most common. You may have other objectives as well. So for example, one of the most common objectives I hear is, we need to centralize our data. When we look at our organization, we see too many spreadsheets, we see too many other systems, there is no system of record. And so we need to consolidate and centralize so that we have this one source of truth, and that we can eliminate managing data redundantly across systems. Another common one I see is what often will be referred to as a holistic view of the member or customer. So if I look at Wes's record, or if I look at Wes's company record, I can see everything Wes has done or everything that company has done with our association. Are they involved in committees, and are they attending events, and how long have they been members, and so on. So very often my clients are saying, I need a better view of my customer. Excuse me. Another common one is improving staff efficiencies. That relates back in part to that data management redundancy. If I'm putting data in too many places at once, that's staff time I shouldn't be wasting. Automation is another good example of that. If I can automate some things, I can improve staff efficiencies. And then finally, improving customer service. Again, that one source of truth, being able to look at that record when I'm talking to Wes on the phone and knowing everything I want to know about Wes is really key. And so, excuse me, these are the common objectives I hear. You may have others, and others of my clients will have others that are very specific to what they're trying to do. So keep that in mind. And you want to document this, literally just write these down, because later on we're going to reference back to them.
Yeah,
so that's
I like
step
the
1. Go ahead, Paul.
Yep. sorry, I like the improved staff efficiencies, empowering staff to actually use the system. So some staff will go ahead and, they're using spreadsheets, they're working outside the system. We want everyone to be using the system so that you get actually the benefit of using the system and your data is all in one place. So it really starts with the staff person, right? So I think that's certainly that goes with staff efficiencies, but embracing the system and empowering staff.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, it maybe goes without being said, but it needs to be said anyway. It doesn't matter how good your system is. If your staff isn't actually going to use it, then you're not going to get much value from it. Thank you, Paul. All right. Step number 2 then is the needs analysis. And again, this is the one that I think most people think about when they think about this process, which is we've got to talk about what do we need from the system functionally and so on. And so my first step always is to say, identify your functional areas. And what I mean by functional areas is things like membership, events, certification, accreditation, exhibits, product sales, and so on, volunteer management, community management, things like that. Because the functional areas, very often the AMS products themselves are kind of divided that way. But it's also, in my experience, that's how my clients think about their association. In fact, I was talking with a group yesterday, and they were pointing out that, they've got a big lobbying arm, and the lobby group, in a sense, is almost like an independent group because they do all these things that no one else in the association does. But they do need the data that the association is creating, meaning they want to know how many members they have in a certain congressional district and how active they are and things like that. That's important to them. But start by identifying your functional areas. And when you do that, then you're going to look at each functional area. We'll talk about membership here as an example. You're going to look at each functional area and you're going to ask, what fields of data do we need to be able to capture? And what functionality do we need out of that functional area? So again, using membership as an example, very simple, name, address, member type, expiration date, join date. That's probably most associations need that. But what's important here is you need to identify all the other data points that you need as they refer to membership, because you want to make sure that any AMS provider you're talking to can actually provide those fields if you need them. And so that, again, this is a starting point, but you may have others like, I need to be able to track a primary contact if I'm a trade association, or I need to be able to track how much the member does in revenue because I use that for calculating dues, things like that. So you need to think about beyond those core things, what are the data points that your association really needs to be able to track within the system? And then the second part of this is functionality. Functionally, what does the system need to be able to do for you? And in my experience, this is actually the toughest part for associations when they do this by themselves without a consultant, is thinking through what can be automated or what can be, computerized to make our lives a little easier. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here, but really demonstrates how detailed we need to get about this. So for example, I've worked with clients who have professional members, and when they join the first year, they get a 50% discount. So instead of the $100 dues, they only have to pay $50 for that first year. It's a way of enticing them in and acknowledging that maybe they just graduated from college, don't have much money. So they've got that first year membership at half price, let's say. The second year, when they renew their membership, they're going to actually graduate to that full membership. So it's $50 the first year, $100 the second year. Well, I need my system to be smart enough to know that Wes is only a first-year member, and when his renewal process is executed, he renews to a full member type and pays that full fee. I don't want to have to go through and do that manually for every one of my new members, so I want the system to be able to do that. That's an example of functionality that you want out of the AMS. Another example from the trade association side, our dues run from January 1 to December 31. When members join during the mid-year, how should they be treated in terms of that price? Some of my clients will say prorate that. Some will actually say pay full fare first year, prorate second year. That's a different type of functionality. And again, you need to know if your AMS that you're looking at can provide this kind of functionality. And so, like I said, this is the area that challenges associations the most when not working with a consultant, is thinking through all those things that we need to be able to do in each functional area. Remember, we got to do this for events, we got to do this for exhibits, whatever else you are doing within your organization, we've got to do that for each area. And as you do that, go ahead, Paul.
Well, with membership, I was just thinking about engagement and tracking interest. Would that fall under this bucket?
That is a great question. And I would say yes, because that is related to membership, although it's also related to everything else, right? So it does kind of touch all those other areas, but I would probably put that in the membership because like you said, we're often calling that membership engagement.
Very good. Thanks.
And so again, the purpose of this, the initial purpose is to get everything on paper so that as an organization, we can, when we're done with this step in the process, we can look at that piece of paper and say, yeah, this reflects what we want to be able to do. And I say piece of paper, this could be a pretty big document with my clients, anywhere from 15 to 25 pages where we're really listing out what we want to be able to do. And so when I write that up, that might look like something like this. And so what we've got at the top is the functional area. This is membership management. We've got a summary of what this functional area does. And this is important for two reasons. One is to actually get staff to agree, yeah, this is what this functional area covers. So we're all on the same page. And also we'll see later when we move to the RFP that summary moves into the RFP itself. So this is actually going to be used to communicate to the vendor what this functional area looks like. And then you start listing the functionality, the primary needs of this area include the ability to, and then we start listing those functional things that we talked about. So you can see here, this is a great one. This is IWA is the International Widget Association. I've hidden who the real association is here, but this is a real description of a real association. Number 6, this is a great example of that functionality. They wanted a 5% discount for current members who renewed by December 5th. Their renewal period was in December, actually November, December. And if you renewed before December 5, they would actually discount your member dues. And that's an interesting rule and not one I see very commonly, but it is something they've been doing for a long time. And so they needed to make sure that their new AMS could address that. But again, to me, that's a great example of, I always say to my clients, what makes you weird? What makes you different compared to other associations? And that's, to me, a good example. I had never I've only, I think, one time before come across a discount for effectively prepaying a dues. So this is what the needs analysis looks like ultimately, again, for every functional area, all those functional needs, and documented, and staff reviews it before we go any further. And staff says, yes, this reflects accurately what we do, or what we want to be able to do if it's not what we do. Okay, so that's a needs analysis. The next step then is developing the RFP, the request for proposal. Now, aside from the needs analysis, which we'll talk about here in a minute, there are several other elements that I think are critical to a good RFP, and I want to run through those right now. The first is a profile of your organization. And so what I mean by profile here is it's not the history of your organization. You know, 3 guys in a bar got together and started us 100 years ago. The AMS vendors don't care. What they care about is, what do you look like, especially when compared to their other customers? That's how the AMS provider is looking at it. In other words, are you a state association? Are you a national association, an international association? Are you a trade association or individual membership, or maybe a hybrid? You have both individual and organizational memberships. How big is your staff? How broad is your functionality? We'll talk about that in a minute. But the idea here is to communicate to the AMS vendor, this is what we look like kind of on paper without knowing all the functional details yet. But do we look like a lot of your other clients, medical societies, bar associations? Those are things the AMS vendors want to see, because they want to be able to say, oh, we understand how you work and we think we have a good solution for that. Or you're totally weird and maybe this will be a challenge for us. So profile first. Second is the business objectives, which we already talked about. So you want to put that in there so the vendors understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. The third, and this is a really critical one, timeline for your project. And so what I mean by that is not only the timeline for this part of the project, meaning when the RFP response is due, when you're going to do demos and so on, but also what is your expected go live date? Because we want to be able to communicate expectations to the vendor early on, because the danger in not communicating that is later on, as you go through this process, you're ready to sign a contract and you say, oh, this will take 90 days to be installed, right? And the vendor goes, oh no, this is a 9-month process. So you don't want any of those kind of surprises. So you want to communicate when you expect to go live, and then the vendors can react to that. If you're unrealistic, they'll tell you. If you've got a good runway, they'll tell you that as well. But communicate your timeline so that everyone's on the same page. A fourth area then on the RFP is the overview of the functional areas. This is effectively just listing. We do membership, we do events, we do exhibits, we do certification, et cetera. The reason I like to list this is because I want the vendors to know right away what they're getting into in terms of how broad your functional needs are. And sometimes vendors don't have strong pieces, for example, certification or online education, things like that. There may be pieces where they don't do that very well, and they should know that up front so they can either tell you not a good fit, or we think the rest of it's a good fit, and here's how we would address that area. Fifth section then is what I call vendor questions. And so these are, again, not your functional needs, which we'll talk about next, but questions about the vendor themselves. How long have you been in business? How many staff do you have? How many clients do you have? Do you offer any other types of software besides the one that you're going to be selling us? Maybe where you're located, or what's your company history and who owns you? That's a big one these days because of so much consolidation. So you want that list of vendor questions, again, just to get an understanding of the vendor itself, because the reality here is you're not buying a car that you drive off the parking lot, the sales lot, and never talk to the salesman again. The reality is you're buying a relationship, because your vendor is going to have to support you for years, hopefully 10, 15 years. And you want to make sure that you're getting into a relationship with an organization that you feel like you can trust and fits your needs. So that's what the vendor questions are about. And then finally, we get into those specific questions, specific needs, that this is where the entire needs analysis really drops into the RFP, so the vendor can see what your functional areas are and what your functional needs are.
So Wes, you talked about profile of the organization and whether they're trade, professional, maybe they're hybrid. Yep. What about sharing must-haves with what they're trying to accomplish in the with the AMS? Should they share this? And what is that?
So we'll talk about the RFP right now. That's a great question. Because when we look at so what I've taken is the needs analysis and dropped it in, and this looks just like what we had before, right? Only now it's on a spreadsheet. And I'll talk about how why I set it up this way. And yes, Paul, I'll get right to that, which is identifying your must-haves versus your nice-to-haves. So when I drop the the needs analysis into the spreadsheet, the reason I'm doing this is because review of RFPs is both art and science, meaning that we can score the RFP, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute, but that which is the science side. And then the art side is reading their responses, looking at their questions about the company itself, and we'll talk about how we look at both of those, again, the art and the science of that. So this is kind of the science side of the things. I've stuck all the issues in here, and if you see under the response area here, I've got that locked down so that the vendor can only respond to in one of 5 ways: base, light configuration, heavy configuration, third-party requirements, or they just can't do it. The answer is no. And when we score the RFPs, we're going to score that based on those base being worth 4 points, light config is 3, heavy config is 2, third party is 1, and a no is 0 points. And this is going to allow us to score each of the responses and get a total score. And we'll see what that looks like in a minute. And this is where, as Paul, you were asking, if we want to, we can highlight those questions that are must-haves. This is a functionality we absolutely have to have, and then we double the points on those, and that changes how the scoring will come out. But there's some things I want to point out here on the RFP, because I've seen many RFPs over the years come from associations when they contact me and say, we kind of went through this process and we're stuck. Here's the RFP we've developed so far, and they'll send it to me. And here are a couple of things I would strongly recommend you do on your RFP. The first, as silly as it sounds, as I've noticed here and noted on the issue numbers, number your functional points. Don't bullet point those. Too often I see a list and it's all bullet points, and you say, well, it's bullet point 13 on page 7. Well, that's really hard to get to. And so I can just say, look at item number 146, and we all know exactly what we're talking about. So number the RFP items. As we're just discussing, identify those that are must-have versus nice-to-have, because the must-have stuff, presumably the must-have stuff means if the vendor can't provide it, that's not a good choice for you. So identifying the must-haves is really critical. You want to make it scoreable. We just talked about that, giving those 5 choices and giving points against that. Another one that I see often associations overlook is for each of those answers, notice I have a comment column. I want the vendor to actually be able to respond and give me comments on those questions if they want to clarify their answer. That's really important. And then obviously with the RFP, just don't forget to ask for the price. Most salesmen realize they have to put a price in there, so they will, but I'm surprised at the number of times I've seen vendors give me a proposal and there's no pricing included. So just specifically ask that question.
I will say also for the vendors, the numbering system that you mentioned, when you get the proposal, it's really nice to see where they've talk about the number and they can put, a price against that number, whether maybe it's some configuration, maybe it's a customization, and they need to price that out. Also, the must-haves, I think it's good to not be shy about what you do in terms of the processes that you have to go through to get from point A to point B. So it's important that you unpack all this. And I know, Wes, you help your clients with this, because if it is complex, then we want to know that, and as a vendor, and be able to price it out accordingly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and yeah, very well taken. Thanks, Paul. So next step in the process, and so now we've got the RFP, that's complete. Now we have to identify who are we going to send this to. And as I said before, and I'll say again, you should be sending it no more than 6. I prefer 5. 4 is fine. I wouldn't get it down to 3 unless you've really done your homework, but 3 is kind of a bare minimum. 4 to 6 is the key. But the question is, who do you send it to? Well, for example, you can go to my website and I have a page that lists about 55 vendors that do membership management of some sort or another, do AMS products. And that list, frankly, isn't complete because there are a bunch of other vendors that kind of do membership that I don't really put on my list. But nonetheless, the point is there are 50, 60, 70 companies that do AMS. And so how do we decide who do we talk to? Well, the first thing I would do is talk to your colleagues, especially any association that does things similar to you, and ask who they use as well as who they've talked to in the past. That's one way to start. There's a big caveat here. Just because your sister association uses product X, and even if it works well for them, does not necessarily mean it's right for you. And I've run into this multiple times over the years where a client will call me and say, we chose product X because they were a state association, and the next state association over chose that product. So we're like, it's got to be good. And it turned out it wasn't good. And that's because even those associations are state associations and serve the similar market, they actually operate differently and they have different needs. So it's okay to, ask the question and put them on the potential list. But again, don't fall into the trap of, well, if they use it, so it'll be all right for us. You really need, that's why we go through this process. But ask your colleagues. ASA has, the Collaborate, their online forum. That's a good one to at least ask around. Talk to consultants like me, of course. But here's the key. Once you've got your potential list of vendors, before you do anything else, you need to contact those vendors directly before the RFP goes out and have a conversation with them about what your needs are at a broad level. Because you need to understand, A, if you're in the right budget for that particular product, and B, if that vendor, at least on a surface level, even can accommodate what you need, especially your must-haves. So before that RFP goes out, you've actually had a conversation with each of the vendors you're going to send it to. And the reason I say this is because, I can't count the number of times I've had clients come to me and say, this is before they started working with me. We sent out the RFP to these 5 groups. And as soon as they tell me what their needs are and they tell me the 5 names, I'm like, well, I can tell you right now, those 2 are way out of your price range. They're just huge systems that you would never use, but they wasted their time doing that because they didn't really do this pre-work. So, my soapbox here is, once you've identified the 4, 5, 6 vendors you're going to send it to, make sure you have a conversation. No vendor should be surprised to be receiving your RFP because you should have had a conversation with them first to make sure they are a good fit. Okay. So now that lecture is over, the RFPs go out, let's say it goes to 5 vendors, everyone responds. And by the way, sometimes vendors, even if you've had those conversations, once they've seen your details, they may come back and say, we can't respond for any number of reasons. And generally that's okay. If it happens, if you sent out 5 and you had 3 of them say no, that would be a little unusual. In fact, very unusual if you've had those conversations. So I would expect if you send out 5, you're going to get 4 or 5 responses. Now you have to review those responses. And so how do we review them? Well, so here's an example using that same sheet we saw earlier. Now it's been responded to by the AMS vendor. And you can see they put in some comments here. They've also selected the base, configure heavy, or whichever it is. And for each of those, you assign points. This gets back to what we just said. Base is 4, configure light is 3, configure heavy is 2, third party is 1, a no answer gives you 0. And if you've highlighted it as a must-have, then you're just going to double the points on that. So if you look at 142, for example, that configure heavy is worth 2 points. But if it's a must-have, then that goes to 4 points. And the reason that's important is because another vendor, if they said it was base, which gives them 4 points, you double that, that's 8 points. So you can see that makes a greater spread between the two. And that's why we kind of double those. But we go through the responses and score those up. And the second thing we do, so like I said before, that's the science. The second thing we do then is look at all the other kind of written responses, which includes those comments, but also includes any of the vendor questions that we asked, and may even include the marketing propaganda that provided. And we look at that and we score the RFP, and then we just do a T-chart of the pros and cons of each vendor. And so a score sheet might look something like this. Vendor X scored 584 out of 600 points, 97%, which is a very good RFP score. And then we've got the T-chart of the pros and cons. Now, here's the thing I want to emphasize. I keep saying art and science. The quote unquote science is the scoring, right? Everybody answers the same questions. They can only choose from 5. So that's a pretty legitimate apples to apples comparison. The art side is, what are the pros and cons of each proposal as you see them? And so if you look at the very first pro here, for this association, the vendor is a large company with excellent resources. That was a pro to them. But an equal con there, and might be a bigger con to others, is a large company with a large customer base may make the association feel insignificant, a small fish in a big pond. But what I want to emphasize is that is going to be different for every association. And so your culture will determine largely what the pros and cons are for any of these proposals. And which is to say, if I got these proposals, I didn't know anything about your association, I wouldn't really be able to highlight the pros and cons because I don't know enough about your association to say, you guys care about this or don't care about that. One of my favorite examples is the third bullet point down. This association has a very active, this vendor has a very active users group. I consider that a pro because I think users groups are incredibly valuable. And a lot of AMS providers actually don't have user groups. So I think that's a big pro. But I've had plenty of clients over the years tell me, we don't care. We wouldn't ever go to the user group because for X, Y, or Z reason. And that's, again, perfectly legitimate. So it may be a pro in my world, but not a pro in yours. And that's what I want to emphasize. The pros and cons list is the tougher of the two to score because you have to really think about what is important to you as an organization.
Something that you spoke to a little bit earlier was, if I'm an organization, I want to look at someone kind of like me, right? In terms of what they do. So I'll throw it out a scenario. So I reach out to someone that looks like me and I learn about their implementation, and their implementation didn't go perfect. So what do I do?
So if you're that organization or are you saying, are you calling them as a reference? And so how do I respond to that?
Right. So how do I, they said, well, our implementation didn't go too well. How do I deal with that in terms of eliminating the vendor, or can you speak to kind of that in vetting okay. The vendor? Yeah.
So Paul, let me answer that. And then of course, tell me if I'm not answering your question, but I think what I'm hearing is, so as the association who's considering vendor X, I hear from Paul, like the product, the implementation was a little tough. So the answer would then be, does that vendor provide options for implementation? Meaning I can use somebody else to do the implementation rather than the vendor. So I like the vendor's product, but then I'm going to go to, say, Aplusify to help me with the implementation if that's appropriate. So I call those implementation partners. And so that actually might be one of the questions we ask during the RFP process is, do you use implementation partners or do you do all the implementations yourself? That's a great point. And that's an important one because again, I've had clients who said, don't care. We're just going to work with a vendor. We wouldn't want a third party. And then I've had others who say, oh, wait, I need those options. I need to keep my options open. So I want to make sure there are implementation partners. So I think to answer your question, if I were on the phone and saying, and you were saying to me, yeah, we had a tough implementation, the first thing I would ask myself is, does this vendor have implementation partners? And if they don't, but I still like the product, then during the demos, which we'll talk about in a second, that's something I would push on to say, how do we address this issue? Did I answer your question?
You did. Okay. And so we don't want to throw them out completely, right? We want to understand. And I would also ask, well, I will make a statement and see if you agree with this. It takes two to tango. So maybe with that implementation, maybe they were, kind of off track. They didn't keep, and so somehow it became one-sided. And so now I'm finger pointing at the vendor, right, where it was kind of like it takes two to tango. It is a marriage, and each has to come to their, is accountable for how it goes. So would you agree with that in terms of, sometimes it gets a little bit gray in terms of the implementation, how rocky it may have been, and who was involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think you're raising a great point, and this we'll get into reference calls because I think this would be one that you might cover in a reference call, is to understand from the association what their take is. Was that all on the vendor's side or not? Because I have found, at least most of the time, my clients are honest with me or potential clients and will say, we had staff turnover, or we had a person running this who ultimately didn't want to do it. And so he wasn't really trying very hard. And so they'll kind of own that and say, we had challenges because of that. So I think that's a great point. You just want to be clear that you're only getting one side of the story. And that's why you have these conversations with the vendors too, to say, hey, I heard from, and you don't have to necessarily narc them out. I heard from an association, they had a challenge and here's what happened. How would you like to address that? I think, and this kind of goes to a larger point, which is one of the most important things, in my opinion, about this process is that you as the association be as transparent as possible with the vendors. Don't be afraid to talk about budget. Don't be afraid to talk about the challenges you've had in the past. Don't be afraid to say, hey, I like your product, but I've heard really bad things about you as a company. Just bring those things up and let the vendors reply to that or respond to that, so that at least you're getting their side of the story and not just getting a piece of the story. Okay, so we received RFP responses. Say we receive 5. Now we want to do product demonstrations. I strongly recommend that you don't demo more than 3 products. Sometimes I'll do 4 if there's really a tough reason for that, but almost always it's 3 or fewer demos for a couple of reasons. One is the whole point of this process is to narrow down our choices as we go, so that RFP response, the review of the RFP responses should have helped us eliminate a couple. And when I say eliminate, it may be they finished 4th and 5th, not because we wouldn't choose them, but just because 1, 2, and 3 were better. And so we may find out we go back to 4 and 5 later. Doesn't happen very often, but it might. And then the second thing is with demos are very time intensive, and they are physically, believe it or not, physically exhausting to staff. And the more demos you have, the more confused staff will be. So you want to limit the number of demonstrations to the best choices based on what we've done so far. And so that's my words of advice about demos in general.
That's a really good point. So,
yep.
So I've got my first demo done. How long should my second demo be based on what you just said?
So second demos. So the first demo is really should be a high level overview. We're not going to get much into the weeds there. But the second demos are, I call them either scripted or detailed or deep dive demos. And what that means is we're now going to get into the weeds. And so the answer to your question in true consultant fashion is it depends. It depends on how much of the weeds you have to get into and how expansive that is. I've had clients who their deep dive demos were only 2 hours. And then I've had a few clients, not many, but a few, who had to do them broken up over 3 or 4 days, and they were a couple of hours each. So they wound up being like 8 hours. But it was because they had a lot of questions about a lot of different areas. I'm sure the vendors would prefer not to do that, but they will if you're a serious buyer and you're really trying to convince yourselves that this is a good product. They'll go through the trouble as long as you're giving them guidance on what should be covered in the deep dive. And so that's that's one of the things I want to, again, emphasize here is you as the association, these demos are your demos, so you should be setting the agenda for the demos. As I mentioned, first round demos should be an overview. The idea is to get to know the vendor themselves, as well as what the product looks like and how it functions, again, at a high level. So that agenda might look like introductions and background on the association and the vendor. And then here are the functional areas we want to cover. Give us, the highlights of those different areas. And again, all that is just to give you a taste and to give you a sense of the vendor behind the product. And, frankly, it's the soft side. What's your gut reaction to that? Because I can tell you, on many occasions, I've had clients who sat through a demo and the first thing they told me was, I would never use that system. Now, the system does everything they need to do, but they said, I just couldn't imagine looking at that all day. I thought it was ugly, thought it was clunky, whatever the reasons are. To me, that's perfectly legitimate response to software. If you're not going to use it, you're not going to use it. And I can't, no matter how much I tell you how great this is, if you think it's ugly and it's painful to use, you're just not going to use it. So those initial demos are designed to give you that kind of that first filter.
Yeah, that's a great point. We talked about empowering staff to use this system, right? And we want all the data in that system, because if they're not using it, we go back to silos, right?
Yes.
So with demos, who should attend? Can you kind of break that out?
Yeah, so this is another, it depends. A big part of it depends on the size of your staff. So I very often work with clients that are 25 or fewer staff, 15 to even 10 staff or fewer. And so I may, the client and I, we may decide all staff sits in on the initial demos. And then if those deep dives are broken up into functional areas, then the people from those functional areas will attend those deep dives. If it's a large organization, say it's 50 staff, then I will recommend one or two representatives from each functional area to, who could kind of speak on their behalf. The only reason, and there's nothing wrong with having everyone attend, except that A, it does take time. So they're not working, they're sitting in a demo, and it could be 3 hours times however many demos you do. And B, if they do ask a lot of questions in an initial demo, that can really kind of derail what you're trying to do. It's kind of the more cooks in the kitchen, the kind of more dangerous it gets. So I like that, for a large organization, do the representatives. For a smaller organization, you might have everybody there. And then the deep dives, like I said, because those generally are very specific and very specific functional areas, then I only show up for the membership one, or I only show up for the exhibits one on those deep dives, because I don't need to see all that other stuff. What I'm focused on is my stuff at that point. That makes sense? And then the last thing I'll say about product demos is debrief immediately following the demo. So if you schedule a demo for 2 hours, you should be driving that agenda. You should be telling the vendor during the demo itself, if the vendor goes off on a rabbit tangent or down a rabbit hole and you're not interested, just be firm and say, not interested, let's move to the next topic. And the salespeople are used to that, they'll be fine. But when that demo is done, make sure you have budgeted at least 30 minutes, if not an hour, following the demo for everybody who sat in on the demo to discuss what they just saw. And you should talk about gut reactions, pain points, red flags, and deep dive issues, meaning if we had this group back, what would you want to see more of? And you need to do, and I'm just emphasizing the immediately part here, because if you debrief even the next day, but worse, days later, staff, even if they took notes, will not remember half of what they want to talk about. And if you have demo, then debrief, staff are going to confuse all those software. Even when I do this with my clients and I'm running the whole thing, my clients still get confused, even with my hand holding. And that's part of the value I bring, is to say, no, you're thinking about product X, not product Y. But when there's nobody there and it's just you guys doing it on your own, the risk of that happening is very, very high. So immediately after the demo, debrief with staff, take notes, determine what you want to see next if you want them back. Okay. Then the final step in the process is selection of a system and contract negotiation. I'm just going to say this, well, a couple of things about selection and contract. I do believe you should call references. The vendors will provide usually 3 or 4 references, and you should contact those. But what you want to do is, to the extent that you can, find what I call off-sheet references, meaning associations that use that product but aren't on the reference list from the vendor. And there's a couple ways you can do that. One is ask the references themselves. Do you know other associations that use this product? Because very often they do. And then there's an opportunity to talk to another association. Go on ASA's collaborate website, their community forums, and ask, does anyone know anybody who works with product X? I'd like to talk to them about it. And you can find references that way. And when you make reference calls, you should discuss, kind of everything they've been through. I have a list of 10 or 12 questions that I provide my clients to ask on those reference calls. But one of the questions you absolutely must ask is, how does the vendor solve problems when they arise? And the way I'd like to phrase that is to say, when you've had a problem, whether it was a bug or just process issue or whatever, when you've had a problem, what was the issue? How did you raise it to the vendor? How did they respond? And were you happy with that outcome or not? Because the reality is, no system is perfect, and there will always be some issues that have come up. And so we want to know how the vendor responds to problems, because the reality is there are going to be problems. And so if the reference says we've never had any problems, then I would think they're lying or confused or haven't been around very long. But they're going to say, oh yeah, we had a problem with X and here's what happened. And that'll give you a sense of how the vendor is doing from a customer service perspective. And what I've heard, this goes pretty much across the board for the last 2 years, probably exacerbated by COVID, is the response time is not great. And so then you need to dig, what do you mean by that? What is not great to you? Well, 3 years ago, if I submitted a ticket within a day or two, I would at least get a response, and it might get resolved within a week. And now when they respond, it's a lot longer to respond, and it's going to be a lot longer to get it fixed. And I think that's just a reality of where we are in the technology sector with demand and resources. And so that you may find that's going to be true across all vendors. But again, I just want to emphasize, ask those questions. Don't be shy to ask, especially your peers, what challenges they have had. And when it comes to the contract itself, make sure you read the entire contract, and make sure you understand what is being written. So whatever is in there that is not clear to you, just highlight that and say to the vendor, please explain to me what this means. Don't be shy about that. Don't feel like you're looking like a dummy because you don't understand the jargon. There's nothing wrong with asking. One of my favorite examples, this happened like 10 years ago. A client had chosen a product, and they were reviewing the contract, and they sent over their questions, and they said, what does section 15 mean? And I had read the contract, and I must have missed this as well, but I read it when they highlighted it, and I was like, you know what? I don't really know what that means either. So this is a good opportunity to ask the vendor. And we asked the vendor, and swear to God, the vendor said, we had a client about, I want to say at that time, they were saying it was 5 or 7 years prior, who had said, we must insert this paragraph in our contract. And the vendor said, yes, we'll do that, even though the vendor didn't really understand it either. They just knew that the client had to have it. So they stuck it in there, which is fine. But then they said, we've never taken it out. And every contract since then has been signed with that section. And my client was the first one to ask in like 5 years, what does that mean? Which kind of scares me, because it means people are reading contracts and not really understanding them. So all that is to say, ask questions. If it uses any term, uptime, whatever jargon buzzword or just sentence that is confusing, ask them to clarify that. And then also, don't be afraid to ask for concessions, price breaks, changes in wording, whatever. Often they will say no, but sometimes they'll give you what you're asking for. And the worst case scenario is they say no, and life goes on. I don't think I've ever had a vendor walk away from a contract just because the customer was asking too many questions. So it's not like there's a danger there of risking the relationship. Just ask the question and ask for, price break or whatever it is you think is appropriate. Don't be afraid to ask.
So Wes, can you speak to kind of red lines in that process? And then also outside legal, when do I retain that? How is that appropriate, and for who? Can you kind of touch on those?
Yeah, I'm laughing at the legal one, because I always tell my clients, if you involve the outside lawyers, it'll just take more time and cost more money, and rarely does it lead to any significant changes. It may. And some of my clients actually have a requirement that any contract has to be reviewed by legal. So that's fine. Those clients, I think, actually do better in the sense that because they're used to it, their lawyers respond quickly. They aren't usually terribly picky because they're reviewing contracts all the time. And so that's fine. But the only time I recommend it is if the client reads the contract and is very fearful about things, meaning this clause scares me or these words scare me, and then they want that insurance of a lawyer, then that's fine to do that. But most of the contracts, if not all of them at this point, are so standard, meaning that the vendor has used them with so many other clients that there's unlikely to be anything there that's really onerous on the customer, him or herself. So was there, oh, the redlining. Yeah. So redlining is the same thing, which is if the client marks it up, then the vendor has to review that. And like I said, it's, in my experience, it's a 50-50 proposition. Sometimes they'll accept it, sometimes they won't. But again, it doesn't hurt to ask.
I know the question comes up, who owns the data, right? So can you speak to that one?
Absolutely. And that's one, by the way, that I always tell my clients that I'm looking for when I review their contracts that they should look for. I haven't, in the last 3 years, I haven't come across any vendor that doesn't include it now, but there should be a section in the contract that says ownership of the data itself, meaning your customer data, your member data, all that stuff, always is retained by you, the association. The vendor may or may not be able to look at that data in the aggregate, but they're really not supposed to be able to look at it, in detail. But you, the association, own that. And so I always look for that in contracts. And like I said, I don't think there's any vendor at this point that doesn't already have that built in. All right, before I have one final slide, but before I do that, I want to just open the floor. If there are any other questions, Paul, anything in the Q&A, does anybody have any questions here before we wrap up?
Let's see. I think we're good, which means that you were thorough, Wes, as usual.
Outstanding. All right, so when it comes to actually choosing your AMS, it really comes down to 3 broad points. The first, of course, is functionality. We've identified our must-haves, our nice-to-haves. Does it address the majority of the functionality that we need? Remembering that no system is perfect. Is the price right? Can we afford this product? As I mentioned before, I've had clients who have sent out, prior to working with me, sent out RFPs to AMS vendors that I knew they couldn't afford or they shouldn't be buying. But is the price right? Can we afford what we're looking at? And then finding those intangibles, that art that I keep talking about. Does the company make us feel good? Does the UI make us feel good? Do we feel like there's a future in this relationship? That's really, really important. And where those 3 intersect, of course, is where your best choice is going to be. But you notice these 3 circles don't all sit on top of each other because no system is perfect. It's only where the functionality and the price and the intangibles kind of come together and say, yeah, that's going to be our best choice for a new AMS. So Paul, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Those are the 7 steps. You're muted.
Of course, as per the usual. So thank you, Wes. Thank you so much. And I have to say, Wes, you are, aside from systems, data. You love data, and we can tell from the stories that you talk about on your website. So definitely, I recommend checking out Wes's website. It's a treasure trove of data, and then you've got your AMSs as well as a RFP shell, which is always nice. And so just want to thank everybody for attending today. Thank you, Wes, for your time, and thanks everyone. And we do have these webinars as part of a series ongoing, so please check back. And everyone, thanks again. And we all appreciate it. So take care.
All right, thanks, Paul. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Sounds good. Bye.